Mark Lackey joins us every week, and typically we talk about small cap stocks that he sees great opportunity in. And then, but before we do that, we talk about the particular metal that he might be discussing on that day. And I know, I'm going to say 3 months ago, you and I were talking about copper, and at the time there were two, if not more, reports from banks, for instance, saying that copper is going to go sideways, and yeah, that kind of thing. Right. But copper was $3 now; it's $3.25.
Yeah, we're $3.24, and interestingly enough, those American banks haven't changed their view, and that's fine. There's a number of other people who are still talking $3, and some as low as $2.50. You know, Pat, I would say that if they're basing it solely on the fact that China's GDP is growing a little bit slower than it was before, then I think they should be looking more at the micro aspects. And because one of the things that I've noted is that the big demand in China, half the Chinese demand for copper comes from the wire and cable industry. And why is that important? Because they're building a world-class transmission system for electricity in China. It's going to be quite similar to what we have in North America and Europe. It's going to take them probably 10 years. But the amount of copper they're going to use is obviously significant. And that demand is not going to wane because, you know, the transmission growth last year was up 20%.
Woo.
That's right. So they're going to continue to do this, Pat, because China has decided two things. One, they want everybody to have electricity. Two, you know, you'll cut your line losses. You have a top flight grid. You'll cut line losses, which means you won't have to produce as much electricity down the road. And they are trying to phase out of their old coal plants in China. It's one thing they're trying to do. So I think this is a good opportunity for them by instituting a world-class grid.
So if some people are calling as low as
$2.50 a pound, yeah.
$2.50 a pound, what's your projection going forward?
Okay, Pat, I'm saying in the next few months we'll be at $3.40, and then at the end of next year I'm saying $4, and I'm saying $4.50 at the end of 2015. So I realize that I'm in the minority. There are some people that agree with me. I'm in the minority, but it's not just a demand issue, because I would point out that there's infrastructure growth in India, Brazil, and Indonesia, well, which tend to be copper intensive. But Pat, there's also supply issues. We've seen two big projects that have been postponed beyond 2016, one in Brazil, one in Peru and one in the Philippines. And so that's another supply constraint. So when I look at the fact, and as I think I pointed out last time I was on, there's been power issues in Chile, where normally you don't get courts stopping the building of power plants. Well, guess what? Right now, a big power plant was stopped in an area of Chile where they anticipated additional copper production in the next few years. Now, I think down the road, those issues will be overcome, but they're not going to be overcome anytime soon.
Well, and we have Indonesia too. I don't know whether Indonesia is big on copper, but those exports, that's a big issue in the gold sector.
It is a factor. It's not as big as, say, nickel, but it is a factor in copper. And absolutely, there's going to be less copper coming out of Indonesia starting January 1st because of all the rule changes that have taken place, some of the value-added rules and some of the export rules. Okay. So it will affect copper.
Okay, now I know you favor small cap, but is small cap better in the case of copper as opposed to small cap?
Well, you know, I mean, Pat, if you wanted to buy Freeport-McMoRan, if you recognize where I think copper prices are going, you'd be fine owning a company of that capability and you'd get a decent return. What we typically tell people is you probably should own the Freeports and own the Teck Resources and own a few of the bigger guys, obviously. But there's also going to be some smaller companies that we think give you leverage. So what we're trying to accomplish, Pat, is looking at people that have experience in various jurisdictions, have done it before, have a good project, they're good management, good infrastructure.
Okay, so you got three names.
Yeah, for instance, Fria Resources. This is a very new company, Pat, just recently trading. They bought a private company that had a very good copper play in Mexico. Now, the reason I like this play is that the management in particular has been very successful in both the silver and copper markets in the past. Two companies they've owned that have done extremely well, and they were in Mexico. So, again, they're going to the right jurisdiction given their backgrounds and given their capabilities and given their connections. They know the Mexican situation quite well. They know who to deal with, who to hire to help run a mine. And so that's one of the big reasons I like this play. It's also a pretty good looking prospect, but it's a better prospect now that the present people have taken it over from the previous people.
Based on the current management, I mean, are they a potential acquisition?
I would say so, because this is what's happened before. And so I think all three of these companies we're talking about today have the kind of management, the kind of resource that in particularly a higher and better market, I would argue you should be looking to take people over now, but that's not tends to be what happens. Takeovers happen more and more once commodity prices rise. So I think you're going to see all three of these on some people's radar screens as we go forward.
Okay.
The second pick is what I mentioned, Tentina, Pat. Now, I mentioned that before on the network. It's gone pretty much sideways since I mentioned it, but this is probably the best copper play in Montana. Good management. They know Montana very well, and they're in a part of Montana that, in fact, Pat, is not environmentally sensitive. That's important because there are parts of the state where you can't do business. If you're near the national parks, you've got an issue. But they're in the middle kind of nowhere, but there's enough infrastructure because Montana's had mining in the past. And a number of these people are actually involved with the very next company we're going to talk about. So it's a very good management team, and I expect it'll be a near-term producer within the next few years.
Okay, and the last one is
Last
Nova
one's Nova Copper. We had Nova on here. Price again has gone pretty much sideways. Again, people have to remember that right now is tax loss selling time. So a lot of these companies are getting hit because they were up higher earlier in the year. And people are taking their tax losses to write them off against their wins in TransCanada and the banks and so on. So I think the next 2 weeks is really a pretty good opportunity because tax loss selling ends basically December 24th. And Nova, they had Nova Gold, which they've been in Alaska there for a couple decades. Nova Copper, they spun it out a few years ago. It's a very successful operation. I should point out this has the highest grade of a VMS deposit anywhere in the world, highest copper grade. So it's obviously going to be a fairly low cost producer.
Okay, so then, but when you say they share management, what does that mean?
Well, they have some common people on the board, for example, and Rick is president of both companies. So there are some other people, the geologists. Some of them are capable of working both sites because they have backgrounds in both Manitoba and Alaska. I mean, the vast majority of management, admittedly, is separate, but there is some common management here, and I like that idea because I think that's important for Tintina because smaller company, off people's radar screens, well, when you point out they've got some of the Nova Copper people on the street, it makes a difference. Guys just say, that's good, Mark, then I know that there's a management team here that has a chance to be very successful.
Excellent, Mark. Great ideas.
Great to be here, Pat.
See you next week.
See you next week.
Have you got an idea?
Well, next week I'm getting so many calls on gold, and I got to be honest, I like what's happened today because I had 1,300 at the end of the year, and we have a couple more days like today. I'm going to be in pretty good shape.
You got to have a few days like today.
Well, I need another 2 at least, Pat.
Mark Lackey is Executive Vice President of CHF Capital Markets. He joins us every week here to discuss what's happening in the small cap space. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're